Let's talk about DS1 Freedom, a module for Dark Sun in AD&D by Zeb Cook. This is the start of my month of Dark Sun. I'll review a few Dark Sun products this month for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition, not for the 4th edition revival. I have done the box set for this, the 1st edition box set of this, confusingly for 2nd edition AD&D, not the revised campaign setting but the original campaign setting, which you can find in the playlist this should be on. This was the first published adventure, module adventure. It wasn't the first published adventure because there's an included adventure in the box set. This is the first standalone module, art by Brom, very fine art. The internal art is by Tom Baxter, who's really the Dark Sun artist, and cartography by Dave Sutherland in his 90s phase. Is this 91? Was there what? 91. So yeah, 1991. This came out pretty much alongside the box set. There's some fiction in it. The booklet itself has NPC stats that you might need there on the inside, and it has the 2-book flipbook format, which was the common format for Dark Sun Adventures, excluding the 2 epic Dark Sun Adventures for the time, and obviously Dungeon Magazine Adventures. I did review A Little Knowledge, the box set adventure, which I think was by Troy Denning and Thingamabob, the other guy who did the Dark Sun box set, and I actually thought there were some really good things about it. I thought it was basically a good adventure, and I thought the flipbook format had strengths and weaknesses, and I think here we have a very different thing. This is David Cook. I did a video on it in terms of how important he is as a game designer. He's a controversial subject. Designed some very, very good and important modules. Co-designed X1 Isle of Dread, I1 Dwellers of the Forbidden City, and a few others that are well worth attention, including, for instance, is it ALQ1 Golden Voyages, and there's some others. He also did DS2 Road to Uruk for Dark Sun. He designed the Planescape box set and the 2 included short adventures in that, one of which is actually pretty good. Freedom is not very good. Let's get that nice box art up. It is not very good. It is all his worst habits. He's famous for some stinkers, maybe. Recently, most eviscerated, Vecna Lives, Prince of Nothing, reviewed that on his blog. And here you've got a lot of his worst habits, which do come up elsewhere in some of these other adventures. He also did 2 of the A series of Slaver adventures, which are, there's a parallel actually to some stuff in here, which have good stuff in them, and maybe a Conan module. Here he is writing a big epic adventure where your characters end up being slaves, and they are part of the great events surrounding the overthrow of a tyrannical, monstrous sorcerer king in Athos, the harsh, brutal world of Dark Sun. And essentially, a lot of this turns out to really be DM story time. And I'll go through a bit more detail, probably not as much as I sometimes would. We'll find out how long this video goes, but because sometimes there's not much to say about stuff that's not very good. But there are some lessons we can learn, I think, from some of the cliched, that what now is interesting. Actually, we now have old school gaming is sometimes used to mean mid to late 70s, very early 80s adventure design, and then you get into kind of trad gaming, which is actually a sort of early story gaming, so-called, so accused. Is more linear. This may actually be ironically unfair to mechanical story games, which are very player driven, but this is kind of linear, scene driven. The DM tells you what's happening and you kind of react to it and you do stuff with it. There are lots of bad habits, lots of bad examples of that going on here. There's stuff with the interesting format, which actually speaks to our obsession with format now, which maybe there's a bit of a kickback now against, but the OSR obsession with format, where here you've got a really innovative, interesting format that sometimes actually works quite well, but it's often also a massive limitation. There are good things amongst these, in this adventure, and you can salvage some of it. But whereas A Little Knowledge was a open adventure, quite sandboxy actually, but pretending to be a railroad is a very strange experience, realizing that. This is very linear, and where there are illusions of choice, they are usually that. They are usually illusions. It's a sign of a very decadent period in TSR D&D. There are two books: the DM's book, which is the adventure itself proper, really, and the player's book, which is sort of takes the place, as well as giving things like sample PCs. It takes the place of the illustrations booklet in something like an S4 expedition, S3 expedition to the Barrier Peaks, something like that. It's something that the players look at to see where they're at. It has battle maps, things like that. This, in a sense, this can quickly be summed up. Just so to get it out of the way, you've got there's a sample PC. You can see the format, by the way. It's these kind of these cards on a ring binder. That's the character stats for the character you just saw. So those can be photocopied or whatever. And then there's illustrations of scenes. Here is a mob. It's Tom Baxter. I like his art. It's very grotesque. It's very intentionally comic book like at points. It mostly works for me, and I think it jives with Dark Sun. Here is a reasonable sample map for this weird 90s Sutherland map stuff. I talked about this in Legends of the Hero Kings, possibly the Birthright book, adventure anthology. You can see here he has these kind of isometric figures to represent map positions. They're pretty, generally speaking, bland maps. There's nothing special for him to do here, and I guess there's a decent map of Tyr. Some of the art in that is coloured. It's okay, it does the job, whilst there being maybe a question mark about, especially because the maps usually aren't interesting, how far the battle maps add to it, or how far they should be in what technically is the player product, albeit the players are told not to read it. They're told to go flick to pages as instructed. There's an introduction as well. There is a quick guide to Tyr that is several pages in this format. There's a how to use this book. There's a quick guide to Tyr, which is a few pages, like 3 of these pages or so, maybe four, which includes a short rumour table, which is not randomly generated, just the players get it, apparently, I guess, and a couple of pages of stuff. But it's fiction. It's describing what happens as the players enter Tyr. It's not usable as a region guide. These are the kinds of shops or whatever. I think it does say the Oven Market is a 50% markdown, but it's very violent. So it's kind of sometimes pointless, sometimes fine. The DM book, the flipbook system, it does say it's describes how it works. It tells you what you need. You need the PHB, the DMG, the Dark Sun campaign box set, and the Complete Psionics handbook. And you may want to read the novel The Verdant Passage by Troy Denning before beginning play. This is significant. It describes the major events and powerful NPCs that backdrop freedom. Now, the way this goes is, this does have a little stand. This is relevant for both the DM and the players, though perhaps more relevant for the players, so you can flip to the card and leave the illustrating card up. That's clever. As a formatting decision, it's genuinely interesting, genuinely innovative, genuinely fun. What we quickly find is, in more than one, and you're meant to use extra aids, like the fact that you've got the NPC summary here rather than on the back of the book or whatever. You already have the fact that very often in the fiction here it's got some NPCs in it. In others it's got monstrous compendium entries. The formatting issues in Dark Sun, in terms of, by that I mean formatting between booklets, the kind of layout decisions, are common and repeated, and regularly lead to information when there's an attempt to be clever and put it in a clever place. And I don't mind it being on this booklet, it's not the worst idea. Instead, and you see they did some stuff with 4th edition with the fold out modules, but often these decisions have unintended side effects of information not being gathered in the right places, stuff not being side by side in a way that a 2 times letter format open up book with 2 columns or 3 columns each can do. The way information is presented is much more restricted and much harder to cross-reference. Sometimes you also are somewhat having to guess the way in which stuff's laid out. Here, you read from the front. It is technically I don't actually know, because this isn't page numbered, is it? That is 46. That is, so I think this is 32 page adventure technically, something like that. But in cardstock. But you read forward. You kind of go this way. Oh yeah, okay. Starting the adventure, flick through. Oh well, on part 2, and then when you get to the other side, to the back, you start again. Part 3 onwards, or part 3, part B. You go reading backwards. So, which is an attempt to solve the problem that is not a flip format. It's ironically a flip book, but it's not a folding, turning format. It is, it's something where you're missing half the information because you have to flip over. So they say, okay, in that case, use these not as the second page, but as the page at the opposite end of the quarto or whatever. Anyway, I know that's a long-winded way of putting it. But yes, it has the upside. It's very compact that you'd expect. And in the player's book, it means it's very easy to present information. But in the DM's book, it does mean that information is actually often presented very frustratingly. You get an introduction anyway. You're off to a bit of a stinker pretty quickly. So yeah, you get the information about what you need. Prep for play. Get players set up. There's some spare maps. The Villa of Varazi is a map in case you want to use, in case the PC's arrivals with the particular NPC involved later. Then the actual introduction is, okay, this is what happens. The first section contains 5 possible encounters. The purpose of these is to capture the player characters. The later stages take place in the slave pens of Tyr. Because the PCs must be captured, the part 1 encounters are unfair. 1 or more PCs will be prisoners after each encounter. No player actions short of the miraculous will save the PCs from eventual capture, arrest, or enslavement. But whoever said Athos was fair, you know we're in trouble from this point, right? That the complete misunderstanding of why Athos might be unfair in the sense it's harsh. You've tried hard, you've made some good decisions, you still get screwed by a brutal world. That's one thing. Here, we're not talking about Athos being unfair, we're talking about the game design being unfair, which is different. Recognise this unfairness, you may allow the PCs to take in some of the sights and sounds of Tyr before running one of the captures. Of course, to allow the PCs to wander, they would already be amalgamated into an adventuring party. The beauty of this approach is that the PCs might get captured on their own. General role-playing, and then it gives the description of these 5 scenes, and then it goes on. 1, some elves start brawling with you. They start brawling with a half-elf. One idea is that part 1, each of these encounters where you might get captured connects you to an NPC, and in later parts they might become helpful. You meet them in the slave pens, basically. In part 1, there's some elves attacking a half-elf, and you might get involved. Part 2, that's with Ormond of the Waste. Part 2, Varazi of Mintur, the arrogant nobleman gets into a scuffle with you, and you get arrested, and you befriend you end up with a mule, a half-dwarf. Sea Preservers, a preserver comes in and tries to hide with you. If you dob her in, you don't ever meet her again, obviously she's killed, but if you don't, you'll get arrested, and that she might later help you. D Press Gang, you might become friends with a brave gladiator who was also press ganged. And E Shanghaied, you go to a wine shop. It's not the wine shop, it's the Inn of the Bleached Innicks, and there you and a Thry Cream there's an attempt at drugging you. And these are all theoretically okay encounters. I mean, some are dull or forced, in the sense that they're kind of like, oh, well, there has to be some sort of skirmish, so here we go. It's interesting how often the role-playing notes, which you get on each page, are let's see, that's the kind of typical format here. The role-playing notes are often very boring. If the players' PCs intervene, the elves happily broaden the fight. They make only punching and wrestling strikes. Unless the characters draw weapons, then each elf pulls a dagger from his clothing. That's very exciting. Serious offence, no matter what happens, the commotion attracts a Templar patrol that comes to restore order. The noble bribes the Templars to arrest the party. Be sure the PCs see the transaction and know the nobleman's name. Again, not very interesting. Outcome, no NPC betrays the woman. This is the preserver. If the PCs Likewise, hold the tongues, the Templars arrest everyone. So it just gives a very brief description, but there's not really much flavour to these. The actual individual ideas are fine, and on a table, I think this is one thing, is immediately you're being told these encounters exist to cheat the PCs, and the way that happens naturally actually kills the scene. It's not that, okay, the fact there's drama makes the scene more interesting. The fact you know that there's this dramatic conclusion, it kills it because it just has to happen. So, okay, the elves, there's no way of dealing with the elves other than you fight them. I mean, what if there's like, I guess if, yeah, obviously Cook says, oh, maybe it's each PC, but he never says, oh, isolate the players and have them do a prelude vampire style. The prelude vampire style, especially if run in trapdoor fashion, is kind of an effective tool. Well, either way, if it's something the player knows leads to their vampirification, it's effective, and if they don't know, it's also effective, or it can be effective as a play gimmick. Here, it's something where it's a trapdoor, and trapdoors can work, but it's not really a trapdoor because there's no way out. It's not very instant, it's not the first scene, it happens to multiple people. There's a recognition the players might escape one. And here I should actually say, I forgot to mention earlier, I've run this module, I converted it for 4E in the first ever D&D campaign I ran. It's the first adventure I ever ran in that sense. Having a look at it, I'm like, and this was 12 years ago or something, 13 years ago. Reading it, I realise, in a sense, how little of this made it through. Lots of it made it through, but also how little. And how little I remember actively because it's not useful. I'll get to some of those examples later. But yeah, the drama is all constantly undercut by the presumed conclusion. The actual things, you know, like the encounter table includes, because there's this tension over the king, Kalak, the sorcerer king, needing more slaves. Okay, well, there's press gangs out. What do you do about it? There's this tavern owner who wants to drug you. What do you do about it? Skirmishes and, you know, there's heightened police presence. Of course, in that case, why the elves are particularly extra active and brutal, who knows, given apparently it's very dangerous and there's press gangs everywhere. But yeah, you know, you bump into a nobleman, he's unpleasant, that gives you some setup. As encounters, they're workable, even flavourful, like, and the NPCs are okay. I like Eramis, the gladiators. There's something, you know, this genuinely good guy who just comes in to help you because you're being attacked, or whatever. Or in Shanghai, it's an interesting setup. What happens is, as an encounter in a place, you have, and you might need flexibility here if it's off a city table, but you have people attempting to not press gang you, but drug you or something, so they can sell you off to the Templars. Anyway, part 2, introduction, you get a boring page of description of what it's like in a slave pen. You then get practical information, food and water rules, spells and psionics regaining, tools and weapons, and bribery rules, guards, statistics for those, crimes that might receive extra punishment than whipping, and escape possibilities. This is not good. There's a couple of bits that are not good, but this is kind of good because it emphasizes the toughness of the scenario. It has realistic, reasonable limitations on players, what kinds of weapons they can improvise. It makes psionicists, because psionicists can get something like 48 PSPs from a night's sleep or something crazy. It does mean that you have psionicists are privileged there, but that's intentional. Preservers and defilers are unprivileged comparatively because they don't have their spellbooks with them, though you are told they've lost their spellbooks. The spellbooks aren't discovered, don't worry. And priests and druids have a limited chance of regaining spells. The fact there are practical limitations and risks, this is actually quite cool. This is and a little knowledge from the box set has similar stuff actually to do with surviving in the desert. Like, this is fun, this is cool. There's one rule question I have, which is that unless you get extra water, each character will lose 1d4 con points per day to dehydration. And there are other effects that stack this, and then finally there's stuff where ability points are being drained magically and hitting 0 means death. And what bothers me there is that feels like that 1d4 con points hasn't been mathematically tested versus the possibility of this being a month-long adventure in-game. And now if it's only a couple of days, it's different, and though it's dicey, literally dicey, what happens if you lose 12 con to dehydration. There are ways of getting extra water. That's obviously a challenge that the players have to face, and that's good. That's a good challenge, but it seems like something where fairly regularly you'll have players probably lose more than Cook is expecting them to lose. I'll say that. The other thing though, and this is bad, is escape. For the purpose of freedom, you do not want the PCs to escape unless a specific encounter calls for escape. The players, on the other hand, will certainly try to escape. All their attempts should fail. Still, the players must believe they had a fair chance to succeed. The following tactics let you program fair failure for the PCs, his inverted commas, both thwarting and rewarding their escape attempts. This is very annoying. This is, there is, you then get to, I think it's in part 3 that, I'll get to that, but in part 3 there's this hilarious, almost accidental callback to this sort of talk. Anyway, DM part 2, it says what the 5 encounters are. There are 5 opportunities to make friends, basically. Extra friends. You've made potential friends in the capture scenarios, and now you might make friends here. And the idea here, and this is an interesting idea, that it sets up the opportunity for you to role-play your way into lots of alliances, or perhaps into alternative advantages. Downside is that sometimes this doesn't matter. It is much better to, with the preserver, the PC who dobs in the preserver goes free and maybe gets rewarded. Everyone else is arrested anyway. You see what I mean? Like they're very limited benefits. It's very hard for the PCs to gain advantage, whether individually, they might be occasionally able to, or as a group. And maybe that's fine in the particularly hard circumstances of the adventure. But it does mean that though you're being told the PCs get lots of opportunities to build relationships, which is really good, often it doesn't feel significant. So yeah, here you can, it also gives their scenes, get the opportunity. The NPCs from part 1, the captures, come and approach the PCs and maybe become friends with them, or at least there's something there. Part 2 scene with the possible enemies. You have a cruel overseer. You get dumped with extra work. This is one thing. There's more con loss possible there. There is some escapees get betrayed by a traitor, and if the PCs have been the slaves involved, they'll get punished too, potentially. Theft, water goes missing. Bully boys, there is a gang who want to take the PCs food, water and blankets. So there's challenges here, and then we get the main encounters. So this is something where Cook is trying to say, look, there's all these things that can happen, and part 3 is actually kind of connected because it is meant to be the development of some points from part 2. This is something where the layout to me shows up its weaknesses, is that really this begs for a spread. This begs for a 2-page spread with double or triple column, laying out all the NPCs and the opportunities and potentially a table of interactions. But here instead you're flicking through it, desperately trying to find the thing without page numbers, but instead with part and sub-part numbering. And the stats there is fine. That's a good layout choice. But yeah, it doesn't work. So you can help a half-giant who's being bullied by some elves. If you don't, the half-giant will end up dead. Then you can help a nice gladiator, Lisanne, who can introduce you to the arena. Treachery, a Templar might try to suborn a PC into being an informer. Plots is Grange, the leader of a resistance cell, or at least, essentially a resistance cell. You might be able to help this guy escape punishment, and so then get involved in potential future resistance. And then kindness of strangers is you help a preserver who's sneaking around, wounded but invisible, and then that means that you get contacts with the Veiled Alliance. Again, the scope here, and I'm less worried about this being an encounter table where bad things can happen or good things can happen, rather than it being forced on the PCs. I actually don't mind that so much. This would work fine on a timetable or with locations for PCs. Certainly a timetable would work for some of the set things, like there's this discussion going on. And the PCs naturally will be around a lot of the time unless they're trying to escape themselves. But imagine you just open this up with, these are NPCs who you can interact with. they have timetables over the course. That's one thing, the whole adventure, when we think about the timetabling issue, especially with the con loss, the fact that lots of things would fit better into a timetable than into the very spongy, soft schedule that you're being given. That some, is at points just like, oh, place this so many days after X or Y, or before X or Y. But yeah, that it's actually, there's lots of flavour. This is something Cook is good at. I think Golden Voyages is a better example of this in his second edition period, because in terms of quality, in that though there are issues with Golden Voyages, there is a sense that he's like, look, you pick the quests, the players go around the locations, there's this stuff here, there's all these cool encounters and ideas. And here he has cool encounters and ideas, but he just wants them to happen, and he wants them to fit into the wider thing, so you don't have to worry about their secondary knock-on effects. And this is reminiscent in terms of not quite the railroading issue, but there are OSR products like that, aren't there? Just where there's just some encounters that are cool thrown in. It doesn't really matter how they connect. Here, it's that they are genuinely sometimes quite interesting ideas or PCs or mini encounters that really communicate some of the flavour of Dark Sun, but you just have to do them. Finally, we get to part 3, and we are told, we're told yet again another bit of a bad play. Part 3 encounters have 2 general goals. The first is to bring the PCs to the verge of brutal death and snatch them away at the last moment, or is a goal of Dark Sun Adventures. Position the PCs so they can take part in later events. Be especially careful with your inclusion of foes, for they have roles later on in Freedom and therefore must not die in part 3. This is relentless. This terrible advice. Let the PCs succeed at killing someone. Wouldn't that help them? Isn't that good? Why? And of course, it's actually that Cook thinks that players will enjoy a well-executed drama where they get to have fun combats, where they get to do some cool stuff. They will enjoy that more than they will enjoy playing a game. And I think this, I probably, some of this, I found that because I ran the first 3 Dark Sun modules, not a little knowledge, but the others I ran Freedom, Road to Uruk, and what is it called? Rebirth of Athos, that one, the third one. But anyway, I ran those, and though at various points they became accidentally sandboxy. Road to Uruk actually has a bit of a mini sandbox at one point, at a couple of points, different things. It's better than this, I think. But the point is that it expanded because your players tell you to do stuff and they're interested in stuff. However, I definitely ran it a lot more linearly than I would now, certainly. I think it is probably not a very good campaign. We enjoyed it. But the point is that this is so relentless, and it's something I don't even remember if I picked up on this as the advice. I think this is something which just seems incredibly obnoxious, but it was very normal for the time, wasn't it? You then get a really interesting thing, the next page. Unlike part 2, in which you as DM selected and arranged the encounters, part 3 allows the players to make their own choices. The PCs have gathered information and developed plans they will want to put into practice. Rather than selecting encounters and directing players, allow your group to choose with whom they want to deal. Of course, after having refereed the encounters to this point, if you stop DMing and simply stare blankly at your players, they will stop role-playing and stare blankly back. True, some headstrong players may have been trying to take over the adventure from the start, but others may be confused by the lack of a dungeon or other obvious location to explore. Watch for such confusion and be prepared to give guidance to the PCs, or possibly even rope them in, literally, to a certain course of action. This is so horrendous as a kind of statement. The fact is there's been some stuff where you as the DM have had to set it up. An initial encounter or a setup to a campaign is a reasonable thing for a DM to be like, this is just what happens. Including the fair but real trapdoor. Now, Cook's gone well beyond that up to this point. But he's like, no, now, look, there's stuff the players know people. You've given them lots of setup. You've given them a space to get to know some NPCs, sometimes in a slightly forced manner. But, it's good. Now they get to act. But of course they might not know how to act because they have never made a decision in the game, and they expect to be thrown at a situation and told this is what you're doing today. And of course, some of the headstrong players who'd like to take over the game might be more willing to act, but others won't know what to do. Cook thinks players having opinions is a problem here. And so when he said, now is the space for you to have opinions, he's baffled. You know, he himself is like, look, players just don't ever make decisions. Have you ever noticed that? They're terrible at this game. Guiding players. How can you hand off the reins, misspelt, to the characters? Be blunt. Ask a simple question. Now that you know a few things, what are you going to do? This is actually good, by the way, as a piece of advice, especially for new players. It's perfectly good to say, you've met a few people. What would you like to do now with the information you have is fine. Of course, games seldom run so carefully. The PCs may choose course of action that don't directly tie to the encounters here. However, because the PC's options are limited to escape plans, treachery, or interaction with known PCs, these tangents should lie along similar lines to the following encounters. On the other hand, PCs overrun by options may become paralysed, unable to reach a decision or make a plan. In this case, nudge them towards encounters which are activated by NPCs. There's some messages that you can get from NPCs you've met before. Then basically you can, it is with Ergos, the mentor NPC, and you might get comically promoted to becoming nobles in place of two nobles who Kalak throws in as entertainment. Very strange scene. The thing with Kalak is I mostly remember voicing him as a smooth operating Tony Blair impersonator in like 2009, 2010, not like after Blair had retired as PM in this country. And so when I'm reading about this, I'm like, I don't really remember this character at all. Who doesn't really do anything, is just a bit weird and mad, and then ends up being in all these weird scenes at the end. But yeah, then there's another opportunity to go to the arena where you can half fight a Tembo. This is foreshadowing for fighting a Tembo later, who is a 4 HD but heavily psionic with some with level drain as well, and a dodge missile. Very, very strange, interesting monster. Management potential, you end up as an overseer. There's potential in both this and the informal one where you can have, and it's kind of aimed at evil PCs. Wow, you could get more water, you could become more successful, you could get some benefits doing this, but there's not very much detail. You get some interesting stuff, like magic might help, for instance, dig, you need somatic concealment, etc. But there's often, and this is again, the nature of the format and text is for an edition and a game that is increasingly overwritten from even the mid-80s, let alone the early 90s. This format helpfully compacts text. Cook does not horrendously overwrite all the scenes. The player's book guide to tier is bad, but mostly it's okay. It's moderately efficient. There are sometimes confusions, like when you have sampled dialogue and it's not clear who's saying what, and you have to guess from context. But it's fine, whatever. But it's that often you get interesting observations where you can tell he's thought about, like, maybe they're going to want to steal the work of others. Maybe they'll recruit other slaves into their gang. Maybe they use magic. Role-playing. Reward ingenuity and good role-playing on the part of PCs. This is one time when you can sit back and let them do the work. Yeah. Champion of the cause, you are drawn into the resistance circle and you basically become part of a debate between 4 different people over what to do next. Whether you should escape immediately, continue to be patient, die gloriously, or it's every man for himself. And you decide basically if you want to argue, and there are kind of some mechanics for that. Dispatches, you can end up actually via a preserver dropping a sleep spell on some guards near your section. Man, I wish you could just do that for everyone. You can actually end up escaping the camp, though, because you're then carrying a message to the Veiled Alliance. You're asked to go back in on behalf of the Veiled Alliance. This is not, though if you do go back in, this is actually good. Spellcasters get scrolls, either sleep for wizards or charm person or mammal for clerics, and every character gets an amulet of protection +1. The guards, this is actually, you're like, okay, that's interesting, and they're allowed to leave. It does, however, say the PCs must remain in hiding or be recaptured. It may be necessary to recapture the PCs to play later encounters. What is given in one hand is taken with the other. There is this hint at this open game several times, as I've said, that's immediately taken away. Part 4, it functions as backdrop. Its encounters are strictly sequential. They provide the PC's little decision making. The PCs witness the epic events. The PC, basically, there's a degree of stuff they do while they're in the arena in the climactic events of the Verdant Passage. But at this point, this is just you watching stuff. You get some rumours about what might happen. You get description, the truth about what might happen. You get Kalak, everyone getting more food and water. Encounters about what might happen before the games. And just, this is all very vague. This is the stuff that should be interesting. But because it's only one of these short pages each, you just get a comment in the pits. People don't want to escape. Oh, in the arena, you're being prepared maybe to go and fight in the city. You know, there's more Templars arresting people. The games begin, and there is an interesting thing here about PCs taking part in the games and how this obviously might be seen as a chance to gain their freedom and the battles they might fight. It also does, for the only time, mention that distinctive Dark Sun mechanic, the character tree, where you have 4 characters and you 2 level up at a time. Basically, when one levels up, you can put another one up with it. And it's just, oh, why not have others in your Tyrian tree? The uninvolved players can use other characters from their Tyrian tree, and oh, that's interesting. Yeah, play out these matches in a separate role-playing session unless all players are involved or if played in a group game. The idea is, this is, given it seems that Cook's main home game was a duet play, I wonder if some of these things where you just think, how is this even connected? How is this meant to run? Partly comes from that. But yes, and you can, other players can use uninvolved characters from their Tyrian tree, i.e. characters who haven't been captured. Cook has not actually thought about the tree almost up until this point because he doesn't assume it matters. You're playing a character who gets to watch the events and be part of the events. Another player might be able to bet, therefore, in this specific case. Then there is a battle with a Gauge, but this is actually an opportunity for you to watch. There's nothing you can do, you just watch stuff in part D of part 4. And then part E is you watch the Heartwood Spear strike Kalak, and there's this bad, I don't think this is from the novel, but this bad rewriting of the novel that you have to read, which involves talking about these characters the PCs don't even know. Rickus and Neva and Agis and Sadira is very strange. Like, it's a very, very odd, and this is something we can't directly blame Cook for. He's not the line manager. He is, I guess, as in he's not the Dark Sun line manager. I mean, I guess he is, I think, the head of the rules team still at that time, but he's not the line manager and he's not the chief editor or anything. So who decided this? Who said to him? Of course, someone did. And of course, it doesn't not suit his propensity for liking scenes people get to that are cool. And the PCs have to act, and maybe their NPC friends advise them, because the PCs don't actually have a scope of decision. They just have to do the thing that needs to happen next. Part 5. So after these set pieces, you get to an interesting mini game where, and it's not necessarily bad. You have to write. You've been told to write, and you might pick up NPC followers now, just slaves or commoners, and you get this Riot combat mini game, and it's not even that bad. It's kind of, it points out you could play battle system, but it doesn't give much guidance for that. It says it's going to be unmanageable to have these large combats with 10, 20, 30 more individuals as AD&D. You could use, I think, Kratis Hold from Dungeon magazine simply says, it says half the size of units in battle system from 10 to 5 to match, so that the scale works adequately. And here there should be advice for the same thing probably, but the idea that it's too big for AD&D, maybe use battle system. He actually says, why not use this thing where basically in any given combat you check the odds of the mob versus the enemy, and it tells you what casualties they take and if there are conditions. So for instance, at 5 to 1 and 4 to 1 the mob will attack and win. 3 to 1 the battle is difficult, the rabble victors, I guess that is kind of almost a noun, wins if the verb, if the PCs face off against the most powerful opponents. Okay, so it's a win if the PCs fight some of the bad guys who are powerful. 2 to 1, the mob will only attack if the PCs win, and the PCs have to personally defeat all spellcasters and half giants. And 1 to 1, the mob will not attack unless incited by the PCs, and will fail unless the PCs win in standard combat. Really, that's just a straight combat between the PCs and the bad guys. and it does say, yeah, it gives rules, and you can pick up followers and lose followers through the course of the scenes, though sometimes that's vague. How you lose followers is sometimes vague. But yeah, it's an idea, and this is, I think, something you occasionally just get from Cook. Things like, here's an idea, here's a good idea, and then, or at least here's a half good idea, and you just think, okay, how does this fit into the rest of this stuff? Where I think basically he plainly doesn't hate rules, he doesn't hate AD&D, he just thinks that AD&D most of the time exists to be, and this is something that is more reminiscent of well, later editions in general, but a lot of 4E adventures, perhaps most obviously, Dark Sun fits 4E in that accidental sense that some of these adventures feel like 4E adventures. They're very scene based, and you have to go and do the stuff. Part 5, yeah, you then get another scene you have to watch, and then you've got options for how you break out. There is the breakout, the milling throng, and you get a useful diagram as a DM about options the PCs might take. Yeah, it's there, it's fine. Into the throng, breakwater, where you're fighting a Templar, direct route, and all these, bloodbath, where you fight the Tembo again. There he is. It's actually a decent bit of art by Baxter. So, and then part 6 is basically you now have to, now is the end. There's one final thing, which is you have to move a stone block closing a passage. This is actually something which is pushed on you somewhat from the Tembo encounter, and it's not clear how, in a sense, almost like why part 5 matters. It's something where the players choose one of 5 options, and they're not that, they don't lead anywhere different. They all lead to the same place, because you have to fight some Templars and some a Templar and some half giants who are blocking a winch room basically to escape, and that's fine. The actual encounter is fine, but it's something where the choice, though technically it matters, you make your own judgments. There's lots of corpses near the apparently clear passage near the Tembo. If you're lowering yourself down into the arena and then coming out via the passage, you're going to have to work out the solution there. That's good, that's not bad, but it still feels like it doesn't lead anywhere. Very interesting. You then do this final battle, and then there's a scene where Tithian becomes king and frees everyone, and that is the end of Dark Sun Freedom. It's not great. It's frustrating because it's a big adventure. There's lots of stuff in it. It even has some ideas. Like, I wouldn't give way to the idea it's a bad adventure. Oh, sorry, it is a bad adventure. To the idea it's wholly bad. There's no ideas in it. It's crap. It's not. There's loads of interesting things, but it represents what goes wrong with Zeb Cook's writing, that he does not really think playwright, and at his best, what is OA1 even called? OA1 or I1, or X1 to the degree he contributed to that, or Golden Voyages. These are interesting adventures where there are options, and where you can see that he sees that players choosing amongst the lines of the story gives value to the story that he wants to tell. Whereas in his worst stuff, Vecna Lives, or here, really, not completely worthless, as I say, but whereas Vecna Lives is nearly worthless. But the point is, and those ones, he just gives up on the idea that the players need to be important. Here, he literally says, maybe because he's been told to, okay, the major events, the PCs don't do, they just get to watch. In fact, most of the time, they don't even get to watch. And you think, wouldn't it be more interesting, even if you want to have this backdrop, because the idea that there's a backdrop with events happening the PCs aren't in control of is not inherently bad. It's not alien to D&D even. And though it's not necessarily a great D&D adventure, it is a really good adventure. Last Days of Constantinople for 3rd edition is, of course, exactly about that, the fact that the city is doomed and what you do with the small things you can do within it. But here, there are these big events, but the big events for 2 whole parts of the 6 parts is really you're meant to enjoy watching other people do cool stuff while you then kind of do a mini game and have then a fight with some tough bad guys. And that's kind of clever, great. As that's decent. It's an okay section. But then the camps, though one, it suffers from a layout issue, but 2, you're kind of told, no, the players don't get to decide many things. They have to interact with the encounters. If they try to escape another way, it fails. Cheat to make it fail. the capture is the same. Here's some interesting, if not amazing encounters. The players have to fail. And you just have to do them in a line. And like I say, there's a difference where it might feel to players like they have all this scope of action, but they don't. A little knowledge in the box set is the opposite, as I said, that it looks like it to you as the DM, like a railroad. The first time I read it, I was like, oh, there's not many decisions here. And then you realise, oh no, you can just put this on a map. It is already on a map, so why not put it on a map? So is Dark Sun DS1 freedom worth getting, reading and running? I think there's a salvageable idea at the heart of it. I think it might be more fun for your PCs to run when they are, you know, get your players up to 9th or 10th level in your Dark Sun game and do it then. Get them involved in the resistance. Get them involved with these growing networks of resistance against Kalak or another Sorcerer King. But that's natural. That will happen anyway. If you want to run it for low levels, I think you need to give players a lot more scope of action during the whole adventure, including up to including the arena stuff. In so much as you need to make it so they can engage with Rickus, Neva, Aegis beforehand. They can help them or hinder them even. They're not automatically captured. In that sense, there needs to be a slight ratcheting down of tension, which sounds weird because Kalak wants to ascend to become a dragon. But what I mean is the ratcheting down needs to be so that the PCs have a scope of action rather than having either dying or being captured, basically. So yeah, there needs to be just enough room for movement. But that's fine, that's Dark Sunning. That can be unfair in the sense it can be harsh. But if the players know, okay, well, maybe we have to go and hide in the sewers. Oh, well, there's the rat people we could talk to and they could help us do stuff. Or, okay, let's get ourselves captured to go in there. Or let's do something else. Let's, you know, we've got some allies who could, with scrolls of invisibility, whatever it is, you can give them options, they can do stuff. Whereas as the published product basically doesn't do that and is one of the weakest Dark Sun adventures, one of the weakest second edition adventures I've read, actually. There are worse ones out there. There was some real shovelware, but it's one of the weaker ones. Anyway, if you've read it or run it, or other Dark Sun adventures from AD&D or from 4th edition, I'd love to hear what you think. Tell me in the comments, and I'll see you next time.